Many areas in the outskirts of Lusaka province have been developed into settlement areas. This is in a quest to address the housing deficit that Zambia is currently facing. On this week's edition of News In Depth, we'll be discussing the housing deficit and measures being put in place by various stakeholders to address the situation. I am your host, Macpherson Mkuka. Stay tuned. Zambia's population has over the last decade increased by over 5 million people. According to World Meters, a global population counter, Zambia's population is projected to increase up to over 17 million by the end of the year 2017. The counter has already indicated that Zambia has reached the 17 million mark, with an annual population growth rate estimated at about 3%. This means that Zambia records a population increase of about 500,000 people every year. It is, however, worth noting that the increase in population has not translated in the desired economic growth in most sectors. This is because the population growth has continued to put pressure on many aspects of life. Among the sectors that have been facing a challenge to accommodate the population pressure over the years and currently is housing. Past administrations did try to address the housing challenge facing the country. In late 1990s to early 2000s, the Movement for Multi-Party Democracy government did embark on a vigorous housing project dubbed Presidential Housing Initiative (PHI) in Lusaka's Chainama area. Although successful, the 2,500 housing units built in the area did not address the housing deficit as expected, as the gap was and is still wide. Government has indicated that Zambia's current housing deficit stands at about over 1.3 million units.
If nothing is done, by 2030 Zambia risks to have a shortage of up to 3 million housing units as a deficit. So as government, we are coming up with mechanisms and ways of how to try and mitigate the shortfall so that, as you may be aware, under the Sustainable Millennium Development Goals, access to affordable housing and clean drinking water is one of the needs that government should work towards achieving by 2030. So we have given ourselves a target as government that we need, at least going forward, to embark on the construction of houses.
Apart from an increase in population, several other factors such as rural-urban migration have been cited as being contributors towards the shortage of housing units. Habitat for Humanity, an international charity organization championing the provision of decent and affordable housing, says few people who move from villages to towns for greener pasture are able to build houses of their own.
When people came from the rural areas and they found that in the cities they didn't have homes, they end up building the same type of houses that they were living in the villages. And so you find that 30% of the houses that we have in the informal settlements are actually made of mud and pole, just like you had in the rural areas. And so you had, like recently when we had heavy rains, houses dissolving and crumbling. It is precisely that kind of house that we have in our townships that crumbles when there are heavy rains. And then in those houses, you find that most of the houses that we're talking about in the informal settlements, they are single room structures.
Another contributing factor to the housing deficit Zambia is currently facing is unplanned settlement. However, the National Housing Authority knows where the need is.
According to National Housing Authority, the need is in the low-income housing area. Most of the people that we have, I think, in the upper classes are properly accommodated. It is the people that live in the unserviced areas that need houses. So if you look at the number that represents the housing deficit, the majority of that number is for low-income earners. And that is why, instead of continuing to concentrate on building houses for the middle classes and the high income earners, National Housing Authority is delving deeper into our mandate of providing affordable housing by making sure that now we can also provide houses for those that are not able to afford to buy a house, are not able to afford to access a mortgage, for example. Their salaries may not make them eligible to go and get a mortgage from a bank. Even though they earn an income every month, they are renting a house somewhere.
The cost of houses, either on rent or sale, is another challenge. A medium-cost house on rent in most urban areas of Zambia fetches about 3,000 kwacha per month. This makes the cost of rentals unsustainable for many families, as most of the landlord's demands are unbearable. On the other hand, people who could not afford to rent perpetually have managed to build their own houses, but with financial challenges. Miss Makalinda Skalinda is a new landlady. She says building a house has relieved her from the burden of paying rentals.
Renting a house was something very difficult because I was renting in Kamwala, and in Kamwala I was only renting a 2 rooms, and a 2-roomed house, it was about 1.5. That was 3 years ago. So it wasn't easy, so I think this is not going to take me anywhere. So I thought of just buying a plot, of which I did some time back. I thought of just moving to, just building just a 1 room and move to my house instead of renting, because that was going to help me to save in one or another. It has really helped me because when I just went to that house, it was just a 1 room, but this time it's a 2-bedroom house, and then we even roofed the house just in 3 years. If I was still renting, I don't think I would have done that. But this has really helped me because I'm able to save that money which I'm supposed to take for rentals. Is the money that I'll use every month to buy material to build.
The cost and non-availability of land for housing development equally has a share in this challenge. Most parts of the country have run out of prime land, and where it is available, it is very expensive. Architect Francis Ndilila says spending over 90,000 kwacha to buy a medium-sized piece of land is reason enough for the majority of people not to own houses. Dr. Ndilila says the cost of building is also very high and worse if one engages a professional construction company.
Yes, the cost of land and building materials have got an impact. As you know, in Zambia, we are importing most of the building materials. So they tend to be more expensive than the countries we're importing them from, because after we transport them and pay duty and customs and things like that, then we come up with a higher cost. You might be able to build the same type of house cheaper in South Africa where materials are produced, or in China where materials are produced, but here, because we're importing most of the materials, they tend to be more expensive.
It is estimated that 80% of Zambia's population is living in urban areas, but not in decent shelter. For this reason, Habitat for Humanity Zambia has dedicated itself to restructuring the houses for the needy minority. The organization is building decent shelter for some selected individual families across the country.
We build close to 100 houses per year. In here in Lusaka, in Kawe, and in Dola. That if you look around, you'll find some places where we have built a whole lot of houses. As your question actually comes at a time when we have just acquired land from Kawe municipality, and they have given us land near Makululu compound, which is the largest informal settlement in Zambia, and starting in July, we are going to start building up to 150 houses on that piece of land.
Sustainable Development Goal number 11 target is to make cities safe and sustainable by ensuring access to safe and affordable housing and upgrading slum settlements. It is against this background that government plans to change the face of urban areas. Minister of Housing Ronald Chitotela says government has an urgent task to develop basic housing in urban areas to deal with the current accommodation deficit and make better cities.
After the symposium, there are different recommendations which we want to subject to cabinet for adoption so that we turn them into government policy. Then we start implementing. One of the policies we are looking at is a program called Urban Renewal. We want to identify areas that we can upgrade, here, more especially along the line of Loya, those areas which are unplanned and settlement. We upgrade them and we modernize them so that our people can have access to quality lifestyle and the decent accommodation.
And Habitat for Humanity feels that reducing the demand for housing should not just be based on constructing more units, but also making the houses affordable for the majority poor.
And so there's a lot of talk currently about energizing public-private partnerships to see how private investment can look at the issue of addressing the housing deficit, and then going further to define how a government can still source funding to provide for the low-income groups, because, like you're saying, by definition, the houses that are being constructed, even by the National Building Society, the National Housing Authority, they are out of reach even for an ordinary working Zambian. They're just so expensive, and so there's need to really look at how government can energize, can resource, so that we look at the issue of social housing again. There's a lot of talk now about upgrading the informal settlements. So the will from government is clearly there more than ever before.
Meanwhile, Dr. Ndilila is of the view that the authority should target low-income earners when constructing the houses. He also feels that financing institutions should consider cheaper mortgages to low-income earners if more Zambians are to own houses.
The mushrooming of shanty compounds is because authorities have not been active in putting up accommodation for people who are coming from the rural areas, the people who are growing up and maturing into families and so on. So we have been reactive. Things happen, the shanty compounds happen, and then we start to want to tackle them. But we should be active. We should create a housing so that young people can quickly get into those houses. When they start their working career, then they'll be thinking about having a family, and that's how a stable society is supposed to be founded and is supposed to be created. But there must be cheap financing for the mortgages. And also, if they are renting, and that is rent to buy, you are paying rent, but that rent is contributing to your capability of buying that house over a long term.
More efforts in cushioning the housing deficit have been going on across the country. Further, the National Housing Authority Chief Executive Officer Waichan Ndlovu says the authority plans to construct low-cost housing units to cater for the low-income earners.
We want to build houses in Kabwe. We have concluded the project briefs and proposals, and we have discussed them with several funders, about 345 houses in Kabwe. We're also thinking seriously about going to increase our presence in Kafue. We have a lot of land in Kafue, and we want to build about 250 houses in Kafue. In Lusaka, we want to build houses for graduates, people who have just come out of school, near the same houses that are at our Northgate Gardens there. We also want to focus on houses for women and children.
New landlady Maklinda Sikalinda says she opted to build instead of buying a National Housing Authority built house. She attributed the difference in cost as a major factor.
I thought building my own house would be cheaper, because when you look at the houses that National Housing is selling, those houses are expensive. You need to be in a company, you need to be in the private sector for you to buy such a house. So it's not very easy. So when you have your own, where you just buy a plot and then you start building bit by bit and you are there, it's easier. It's because of the way the economy is. A lot of people don't have houses because even just land itself, because a lot of people want to get land just here in Lusaka. And you know, where we want all of us to squeeze ourselves just here in Lusaka, it's not easy, because just to get a 25 by 25 meter plot, it's about a 40,000 kwacha, 45,000 kwacha. But when you go out there, somewhere very far, maybe in Kapiri or maybe places afar, it's easier, because you'll be able to get a 25 by 25 land for maybe just about 3,000 kwacha, 4,000 kwacha.
And Minister of Housing Ronald Chitotela says government, working with the implementing agency, the National Housing Authority, is in the process of devising house purchasing program that will enable more Zambians to acquire the houses.
We intend to revise and to look at the mechanism on how we construct these houses, the kind of the materials we will use, but we will not compromise on quality. And I've even told the National Housing Authority, let's embark on building low-cost houses, because the big houses, the owners in that class, they can afford to build their own houses. That's why you can see National Housing previously would build beautiful and expensive houses. Up to this time, some of them, as you referred to, are still sitting vacant, because the class they were targeting are able to build their own houses. So I've said, let's target the middle and the lower class of the Zambian people, those who cannot afford to build their own houses. Hence, immediately we finish, we give to them with a view, a policy of rent to buy. Once the house is allocated to you, even if you are transferred from Lusaka to Livingstone Mukuka, it still remains a house, because the deduction will be done at source. After it is fully paid for, maybe for the period of 5-10 years, then it becomes your property.
Zambia's common method of building housing units has been that of taking more space on land than in the air. This limits the space available on land and produces limited housing units. However, the National Housing Authority has a new plan. The authority, under the Urban Renewal Project, plans to construct high-rise flats on the land where Mrs. and Cook compounds lie.
The biggest thing that is exciting to National Housing Authority about Mrs. Cook is the transformation that it's going to give to the way that the people in Mrs. and Cook live, to change the living conditions that they live in now. Because what the project is doing is it's going to use the same piece of land where they live and use the same road, whether it is the blue water dam, everything that is there is what we are going to use, except that we're going to bring down the houses and build better houses. We are going to build going up instead of building these gallows that are there now. We want to build flats so that we maximize on the use of the land.
The NHA chief further explains progress that has been made in mobilizing funds.
We have advanced in acquiring funding for the first phase of the project, which includes feasibility studies, consultations, sensitization, servicing of the land, and mapping the area to understand how many people are there now, because the last studies were done more than 5 years ago. So we want to understand the growth of the population, the change in the weather patterns, what is happening to the rock under the blue water dam, and all of those things. So we can say that the project has started. Because of the magnitude of the project, it's going to take a number of years to conclude it.
The authority has the full support from government over its plans.
Urban renewal is the way to go, because people that are living in those unplanned settlements, they did not choose to stay in the manner that they are staying, but it is out of desperation, because everybody wants to live in Lusaka. So going forward, after we begin upgrading Lusaka, Copperbelt, and the urban cities, we need to start creating satellite cities along the countryside, so that we discourage the rural-urban drift. We reduce on urbanization, because everybody wants to come and stay in the urban area, because the rural areas have been neglected for a longer period of time. Now we need to start taking development to the rural areas, so that we start planning and developing the rural areas.
Dr. Ndidila is for the idea. He, however, suggested that the high-rise flats in question should not have more than 4 stories.
High-rise flats, they are feasible and they make a lot of sense. If you see the size of Lusaka is very broad, because we always put on these little single-story houses all over. Yeah, when the town is too broad, the cost of infrastructure, the roads, the sewage, the water pipes, they are also very long and unaffordable. If you've got concentration of population flats, yeah, you tend to concentrate also your utilities and your infrastructural services in smaller areas.
Previous governments did have housing projects through local councils which were aimed at reducing the shortage of houses. However, almost all houses under the hands of the council were sold out to sitting tenants who at the time were council employees and civil servants. This was during the MMD government headed by late Frederick Chiluba. Mr. Kanyata feels there is need to recapitalize local authorities and allow them to start constructing houses again.
Perhaps what needs to be done is to go back and look at the role of the municipality. How can we still build the capacity of the municipality so that they can be involved still in providing low-cost houses for the people? Okay, so capacity is needed in there, and guarantees from government, because how the councils built those houses, they had guarantees from government where they were able to get loans from financial institutions, including even from pension schemes, in order to build those houses, which inherently brought them a lot of revenue, which they were able to recycle to build more houses. Now, when the councils went out of it, it even brought a lot of speculation where land is concerned.
And Dr. Ndidila also suggests that there is need to open up new areas for housing development, adding that such areas must be pre-serviced.
You know, the housing deficit, apart from money, we should make sure that new areas of housing are opened up, where plots can be given to people, sold to people. But these new areas, these plots, must be serviced plots. There must be roads there, there must be water there, and there must be sewage there.
And the good news is that government is already taking into account such plans.
If we, in the next year's budget, will borrow 10 million kwacha to build roads and the airports, we must also borrow 10 million kwacha to build houses. Even in the next year's budget, I've even told the PS, we must provide budget line for construction of houses for civil servants. Nurses require houses. Teachers need houses. Police officers need houses. All those who are working in government, in the ministries and various spending agencies, including parastatals, including workers under the NBC, you need decent accommodation. So we have agreed and have told PS, going forward next year, and even the Minister of Finance, I told him, we must provide substantive financial resources towards the construction of housing units in Zambia.
In addition to the plans by the Ministry of Housing, the National Housing Authority says it will continue constructing more housing units. The authority, working in partnership with other stakeholders, targets to build about 10,000 housing units every year.
The President had said in his speech to Parliament, it should be in 2015, when he said we need to build 10,000 houses every year in order for us to build towards curing this housing deficit by 2030. And that is the mandate that we are following as National Housing Authority, to see if we can build 10,000 houses. It's a mammoth task.
Government has made steady strides in cushioning the housing shortage in the country. So far, over 1,000 housing units have been constructed for various families of men and women in uniform in the 2 ministries, Defense and Home Affairs. Houses for civil servants and council workers in various districts have also been constructed. However, these are just a drop in the ocean, bearing in mind the over 1.3 million housing deficit. What remains now is for government to work towards Sustainable Development Goal number 11, which demands that countries must ensure access for all to adequate, safe and affordable housing and basic services, and upgrade slums by 2030. This is why we come to the end of this week's edition of News in Depth. We have been discussing the housing deficit that Zambia is currently facing. It has been disclosed that Zambia needs over 1.3 million housing units to address the situation. I have been your host, Macpherson Mkuka. Be sure to join us next week for yet another exciting News in Depth program. For now, it's goodbye and God bless you.